Hi everyone and welcome. This is the Street Drugs Discussions, Gender Dimensions of the War on Drugs. So thank you everyone for dialing in and joining. Thank you especially to our guests. So we have Professor Julia Buxton from Manchester University. Also though, we will start though with Dr. Jennifer Fleetwood calling from Goldsmiths. So we're talking today about a number of facets of gender dimensions of the war on drugs, which will include women's involvement, impacts on women, and both of our guests here have done very, very extensive and interesting research on that topic, which they'll be very happy to share very shortly. Before I do get going though, so yeah, we're planning to go for just about 2 hours. We have Jennifer for 1 hour. Before then she must redirect herself to induction events, and then after that,
Don't worry, James. I have managed to clear my timetable, so.
Oh, wonderful. So we have everyone for 2 hours. Excellent. Thank you very much. So that is great. So yeah, we have Jennifer and Julia for the full 2 hours. So yeah, we will be talking many facets of the war on drugs, gender involvement, women's involvement. But just to say, as we're going, I'm very glad to see the chat being used to all let us know where you've come from, who you work for, your kind of drug relevant employments, etc. So that's excellent to see. Please do continue to use the chat. Post your comments there, post your questions. This webinar works best and as it's most kind of conversational, where hopefully we'll kind of learn the most from Julia and Jennifer as they are discussing these key issues with one another. But please do chuck in your questions for them. If it's really, really relevant to what they're saying, I may well kind of butt into the conversation and say we have a great question from whoever has posted it. But then as well, I think after we've got through the main discussion points, the end of this webinar might turn into something of a Q&A. Without further ado, then I will introduce Dr. Jennifer Fleetwood of Goldsmiths. And I think possibly many people I first became aware of Jennifer when reading her book on women who were imprisoned in Ecuador, which is an excellent book and excellent story of how it came to be. I think we met once at an event you organised at LSC about 4 years ago or so. Actually, of the people who were there, I met a huge proportion of those have since gone on to speak on this. So it's a great event and been hugely useful for this sort of thing. So yeah, Jennifer, please do introduce yourself. Tell us about what you do. Tell us about your research.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you for the invitation to come and speak today. It's a real pleasure, and please do chip in with questions. Otherwise, I'm liable to kind of ramble a little bit. So yes, do use that question and answer feature. First thing to say is if you want a copy of my book, I have a PDF which I downloaded from the internet from a dodgy website. So if you would like a copy of that, you just send me an email at my Goldsmiths account and I can send that to you. I don't make any money off of it. I mean, if I ever did, I definitely don't anymore. So please do feel free to get in touch. Brilliant. Send me an email. Okay, so as a way of introducing myself, I will tell you a bit about my research. So I guess my interest in the topic is my email address. I wonder if I can put this in a chat somewhere. I'll maybe just say it out loud and then later on I'll work out where it goes. Oh, wait, here it is. It's in the chat. I can do this. It's j.fleetwood@gold.ac.uk. So there's my contact. So I guess my way into this topic is really thinking about women as people who work in the international drug trade. And I think I tend to try and use the word trade rather than market, because I think when we talk about drugs, there are all kinds of metaphors in play. So there's a war on drugs, which brings an assumption that there's an enemy who needs to be targeted. And I also think market can be a bit of a metaphor that suggests that people there are there by choice, or that we can understand the drug trade through kinds of politics or market or economics. Whereas I think my perspective really is understanding the drug business as a sociological phenomenon, as a place that is peopled by individuals who are in webs of relationships and responsibilities, who have their own ideas about what they want to do or be in the world. And I think understanding those things can really help us understand why people are involved. Okay, so I've had 3 projects, more or less, on women's involvement in the drug trade. And I'm not really so much writing about women as women who are using drugs, although there are overlaps, of course, between women who use drugs and women who sell or traffic drugs. So the first project was on drug mules. And I was really interested in women's involvement in the international drug trade. And at that point, there had been lots of studies trying to understand women's motives. And I think this work was often underpinned by a kind of a gender judgment, right? So why is it that women who are so caring and non-violent and, you know, live in these domestic spheres, why would they get involved in this awful, violent, transnational organized crime phenomenon of drug trafficking? And I found this kind of framing of the problem a little bit strange. So I was interested, of course, in people's motives. And I think men and women did have different motives for getting involved, reflecting the fact that women's lives and men's lives are often structured differently in terms of, you know, access to employment or caring responsibilities. But I think I don't want to overplay that, right? I think for women who are young and men who are young, often their ideas about what they want are overlap. So wanting to travel, wanting to visit different parts of the world were also part of the motives for wanting to get involved in the drug business. But I think I also wanted to unpack what the connection might be between gender and exploitation. So there tends to be an assumption that men are involved in the drug business because they're motivated by fast cars and making lots of money, whereas women are motivated by caring for children or exploitation. And I think this bias is really problematic. So in a lot of early news coverage of the drug business, there was reports about women who would swallow capsules of cocaine, and this was often taken as evidence of their exploitation. And I think it's a real mistake. So looking at how people are actually involved in the drug business and what they actually do is the only way for me to really unpack this. So what I'm getting at here is I met a man who was from Italy, and he used to make his own capsules and swallow them himself. So it kind of, for me, really tested this idea that women are always exploited and that men aren't always exploited. For me, there was like this huge variation of why and how people were involved. And actually, if you were a drug mule, it didn't matter a huge amount if you were a man or a woman. Once you'd agreed to traffic drugs, or once they'd agreed to traffic drugs, they were working within a system that offered them almost no control over what they were doing. So they didn't know what they were carrying. Often they didn't know where they were going. Often they were misled about what they were carrying. They were told they were carrying, 200 grams of cocaine. And then when they got arrested, they have 5 kilos of heroin. So it's a job or a role that's fundamentally characterized by exploitation. So for me, it's a reminder that when we look at men's and women's involvement in the drug trafficking or the drug market, drug trade, we shouldn't assume that we can read exploitation at a distance. I think to understand the connections between gender and exploitation, I think, means getting a bit close up. Okay, I'm going to try and whip through this a little bit more quickly because I'm rambling already. Okay, so the second project was looking at women who were selling crack cocaine and heroin in England. This was a much shorter project, and we found 8 women who had been involved in trafficking, in selling crack cocaine and heroin. And the way that gender worked here was in how women undertook their business. So having caring responsibilities could be really important in how women approach the job. There was one woman who had just 5 people that she sold to, and she would sell to them on a Friday and a Saturday, and that was it. The rest of the time, her phone was switched off, she didn't work. And it was a way for her to make a bit of extra money. She had these reliable clients, and she would refuse to sell to anybody else that contacted her. And actually, most of the women that I spoke to got involved, sold for a time, and it funded their drug use, or it got them through a particular period of their life, like when their children were small or when they were studying, and then they got out. And most of them never came to the attention of law enforcement. So for me, this also asks questions about what does it mean to be successful in the drug trade? So often we think that success means climbing the hierarchy and being at the top of the business, which I think is a really weird assumption. What about if being successful in the drug trade is selling drugs as a way to support yourself through a particular period, as that seemed to be the case for those women. And the most recent project is really thinking about women in online drug markets. I'm going to try and make this really brief, but I think there are two things I want to say. One of them is that a lot of research on online drug markets makes gendered assumptions again about who's involved and what they do. And I think those are really, really worth questioning. So there's an assumption that like Bitcoin is all something that's kind of dominated by men because women don't understand computers, which is obviously incorrect. And then there's also an assumption that kind of dark markets are where it's really at. Whereas I think actually there are online drug markets that we can find that are completely dominated by women. And often thinking about women and thinking about gender tests our assumptions of what on earth even constitutes a drug market. So, for example, there's an organization called Women in Web, and it's an organization that organizes so that women who would like access to drugs to terminate pregnancy at home are able to do so. And they especially make these medicines available to women in contexts where they could not otherwise get them. So here we have an international drug market where drugs that are outlined or are outlawed in particular contexts are sent throughout the world, and where it is almost entirely dominated by women. So it's a drug market set up by and for women. And it really challenges our assumption about what on earth we think is a drug market. So that's my kind of the work that I've been doing at the minute. And hopefully I've not spoken for too long or too boringly. But I think that's where I'll stop talking just now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Jennifer. Definitely, it was neither of those two things. I might actually ask you just a couple of questions, well, one question before I do hand back over to Julia. Just tell me how it is across the three projects. Presumably, in all of them, you access women to speak to. I mean, I know the answer for the first one, but I'm quite interested to the read of that. And if there's anything you can say for projects 2 and 3, please do. But if you can't say that, that's also no problem.
So the third one of women in online drug markets, we haven't spoken to anyone who actually works in online drug markets, partly because there is so much data available already. So when there are studies kind of surveying, women and men about the kinds of things that they buy online. So we've drawn on that kind of research. But also when we've been writing about it, there's a book chapter looking at a drug called modafinil. Right, so modafinil is an interesting drug. It's a drug that promotes wakefulness. Apparently, lots of students take it to help them stay up all night and concentrate on their projects. So it's not one that's like naturally gendered. But we looked at the different websites that sold them. There's like e-pharmacies. There was another one called, I can't remember what they're called. We had to anonymize them because they're still operating. But the ways that they sold their products was so gendered. So in one of them, they talk about, how to be one of them, it's like this super macho bro type guy who talks all about productivity and talks about how you shouldn't mix modafinil with going to the gym, and everything he talks about, he just assumes that the customer of modafinil is men. Whereas actually we know that about 40% of people who are buying modafinil online are actually women. So there are these gender representations and ideologies, even without speaking to who is actually there. Gender is still super integral into how these markets work, right? So if you imagine in the olden days, if you wanted to buy drugs, you would need to find a person to buy it, whereas now it's all online. So these representations are super important. So this is a bit of a tip really for students who are thinking about doing dissertations, is that you don't necessarily always need to go and find people. There can be a tremendous amount of information available if you just go looking for it. How we found the women who were selling crack cocaine and heroin was someone knew someone. That's the short story. Yeah.
Say a little bit more about the Ecuador study, or?
Gosh, so I got involved in prisons in Ecuador because I was backpacking there, and heard that it was possible to visit prison. This prison is now since closed, which means I'm able to say a bit more about it than in previous times. But I was just visiting as a tourist, and all you needed was somebody's name to get into the prison. So I did that and got to know people, and they were really happy to have a visitor, because being imprisoned far from home is fundamentally quite shit. And having someone to speak to and tell you what's happening in the world, and to chat to, and just for a moment, forget that you're in prison, I think was really pleasant. So they invited me to come back, and I got research funding, and then that turned into my PhD. But my undergraduate dissertation was actually done in prisons in Ecuador, and I think I was probably one of the last people to get away with that kind of thing, basically.
Yeah, so that's awesome. So thank you very much. And yes, having read your book, I thought it's so cool that you were able to base a dissertation basically being able to email your supervisor or a lecturer. Can you be my supervisor? I'm visiting a prison in Ecuador. Any chance this can be it? I think, alas, the pressure of modern ethics panels might make that somewhat tricky to get positive feedback from if you do ask
a bit trickier now, I would say.
Yeah, unfortunately, worth asking, always worth asking, but probably a lot trickier to pull that one off. So thank you very, very much for that. So now, Julia, if you could come to the microphone. Yeah, so please let us know about the research that you've done. And yeah, very much enjoyed the summary given by Jennifer. So if you want to tell us something along those lines, or along different lines relating to the research that you've been doing.
Okay, thanks, James. And I'm sorry, I'm a bit orange here. I'm not so sure what's going on in this room. So just in terms of background, I kind of come to studying drugs from some very, very different perspectives. My actual academic background is in conflict and peace building. So I kind of came into drug policy through kind of conflict analysis and understanding the role of narcotic drug markets in conflict and violence. I'm actually a Latin Americanist by background, so my PhD was on Venezuela, so I'm very kind of interested in that Andean dynamic. And before COVID, I was working in Budapest for 8 years at an American university there. And what was interesting for me in Budapest was that my kind of neighborhood, the work that the kind of area of the work that we were doing was Russia, it was Central Europe, it was Central Asia. And those kind of three dynamics, I think, for me, conflict, kind of being in that Budapest experience and as a Latin Americanist has kind of shaped different research questions for me, but which overlap with Jennifer in terms of the very kind of gendered nature of drug trade, of the drug trade. So essentially, I'm kind of working across a number of different areas at the moment. My research really is interested, and this maybe kind of broadens this conversation out so we can, kind of focus back in on these questions about, the war on drugs. My research is very much on these really major changes that we've seen in the international drug trade since the end of the Cold War. So really from the 1990s onwards and into this current 21st century. And what's hugely interesting about what's happening in the international drug trade is that we have had patterns of dynamic growth, really quite incredible growth compared to where we were in the 70s and the 80s. We've seen areas, territories, and also demographics that were previously insulated from the drug trade, now very much impacted by drug markets and by drug use and by drug supply and dealing. I think a really, really important change is the growth of synthetic drug markets. Right now, I think one of the most tremendous changes that's occurring, particularly across Southeast Asia, is in relation to the growth of methamphetamine markets. Afghanistan is now becoming a major methamphetamine supplier and producer. And what we're seeing, I think, is synthetic markets really kind of gaining ground on the traditional plant-based drugs, so the cocaine, the opiates, and the cannabis. But at the same time as those synthetic markets are growing, these traditional drug plant markets are also growing. We're at record levels of production and cultivation for those plants as well. Cannabis markets have boomed over the last 10, 20 years. We're seeing patterns of what I think is a really, really interesting trend is, in kind of political economy, we call it import substitute industrialization. And this is where countries essentially start manufacturing domestically what they traditionally used to import. And I think that this is what we're seeing in drug markets. So some of my work is looking at this shift between the global north and the global south, because drug enforcement strategy has always assumed that enforcement and the flow of drugs is from the global south cultivation zones to global north consumption zones. But this is dramatically changing. And we're seeing, countries like the UK, which are essentially becoming self-sufficient in drug markets, in the drug trade. And I think that COVID and lockdown, the experience of lockdown, has really accelerated some of these trends. So those are the kind of main thematics that I'm looking at, just those shifts, trying to track what those shifts are and understand what they're being driven by. This is going to kind of link us back to Jennifer's, the previous discussion we had before in terms of gender. But I think the key kind of drivers of these change are firstly, trends of globalization, which we saw from the 1990s onwards. In particular, I think a big shift has been neoliberalism and kind of market liberalization, financial liberalization, because this has had two effects. On the one hand, it's made, significant sectors of the global population poorer and more reliant on engagement in the informal economy and cultivation of drug crops. And at the same time, it's made another sector of the global population wealthier, more autonomy, more money to spend within the drug trade. So we've had these very, very kind of dynamic impacts. Technological change, as Jennifer mentioned, has also been a hugely significant driver of these rapidly evolving drug markets. So not just in terms of the internet, but also in terms of hydroponic technologies, which are speeding up and accelerating cultivation, kind of solar powered cultivation technologies, which has really driven opium poppy cultivation in places like Afghanistan, but also digitally enabled drug transactions. This is really kind of changing, as Jennifer was talking about before, changing the nature of online drug supply and how we purchase drugs. So these shifts, I think, are really significant. And what have they resulted in? And this is the current work I'm doing at the moment with the British Academy. Essentially, what we're seeing is cheaper drugs, purer drugs. We're seeing an increase in treatment demand. We're seeing changes in the nature of treatment demand. We're seeing elevated levels of drug-related overdose and death. And we're also seeing an increase in drug-related violence. So those are kind of patterns that we can track over the last 10, 15, 20 years internationally. And I think the key issue here, and this really is the focus of my research at the moment, is how are countries responding to this? Because if we accept that drug markets are undergoing dramatic change, we have to rethink policy, how are countries responding? And the key challenge has been that historically, countries have always responded through strategies of criminalization, market interruption, and punishment. And this has been the strategy for decades, if not a century, if you want to go back into the kind of history of international drug control, because all of our countries are bound essentially to the same strategy, the same policy through our obligations under the United Nations drug control treaties. So what we're seeing now is that a number of countries are trying to kind of navigate this more complex and dynamic international drug trade. And the way they're doing that is through measures to reduce the harm associated with drug use, through measures that try and introduce, for example, rights-based responses, human rights-based responses, rather than simply aggressive policing. Because what we've learned is that aggressive policing has hugely counterproductive impacts. These are disproportionately felt, determined by race, determined by social class, determined by gender. So drug policy itself, the traditional enforcement model, is a real tool of driving social, racial, and gendered inequalities. More problematically, this kind of enforcement response, and in particular, maybe Jennifer, this is something we can go back and talk to, this trend of incarceration, these elevated levels of people who are going to prison on the basis of non-violent drug-related offences, something which is in particular impacting women, really significant increase in the number of women who are going to prison on drug-related possession and supply charges. This is not actually dealing with the problem, because I would argue, and Jennifer, again, maybe a discussion we can have, prison as an incarceration, they're no longer guided by this kind of rehabilitation ethic. It's very much about punishment. So when people are coming out of prison, we're seeing elevated levels of recidivism, people are reoffending because they don't have the skills, they don't have the training, they don't have the networks to kind of go into other forms of activity that don't put them back into the kind of peer groups and communities that they were originally part of. So the real challenge is that these enforcement responses, this policing and punishment responses, in essence, I would say, are criminogenic in themselves. They drive engagement in the drug trade. They don't deal with the drug market problems. And what they've actually done, I would argue, is basically proliferate international drug trading. This has been the effect of this enforcement-led response, and most particularly a driver of stigma. And when you have a regime based on punishment, incarceration, the stigmatization is a major, major obstacle, in particular, which is our discussion today, for women trying to access treatment and access services. Now, essentially here, just to wrap this up, my two kind of previous publications, both open access. One of them is on drugs and development with my colleague Khalid Tanasti and Mary Chinwe Hesse from Ghana. And what we're looking at in that publication is essentially how global north drug enforcement priorities impact countries in the global south. So places like Colombia, places like Afghanistan, Peru, these traditional supply zones, how their drug enforcement strategies are dictated from overseas, causing tremendous harm to these countries and communities. So that's one book. And then the other book that I recently co-edited is called Shifting the Needle, and it looks at the impact of drug policy enforcement specifically on women. And what that book does is really encourage people from women from around the world, ranging from Colombian coca cultivating women to women working in Russia, to highlight and demonstrate the terrible and negative impacts on women that drug policy enforcement has. So in sum, James, I'm all over the place. The problem when you research drugs is it's like, it's down the rabbit hole territory, because every time you start researching one dynamic of the drug trade, it leads you into bigger research questions about other aspects of the drug trade. So that was just kind of a kind of holistic response to you, which was just trying to put this current conversation in terms of gender dynamics into this wider international picture.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thanks. Actually, so I think what I will do is in a minute ask Jennifer her views on the greater punitiveness, greater use of prison, that impact. And there's a couple of things I'll clarify with you. So firstly, well, I very much believe you that the drug business has been booming for quite a while. I'm very interested in what's all the evidence for it. Is it user data that more people are using drugs, so presumably there's more trafficking in them? Is it more seizures at the ports and in countries showing that more is on the move? Or are there any other things that make you sure that business is booming in the drug trade? And secondly, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how the markets are changing, maybe how COVID's related to that. So you talked about how increasingly countries who used to import a drug now make it themselves. I wonder, is that one of the things that has accelerated through COVID? And are there any other changes that we have seen recently?
Okay, so when you say, is business booming globally? That's a bigger conversation we could have about the reliability of data in drug market research, because obviously there's major obstacles to us getting, good empirical data. And this is really the heart of the problem with drug policies. It's not based on robust empirical evidence. The data that I use works with official data, largely from UNODC. Any students who are working on drug markets, you will need to look at the World Drug Report, which is based on the submissions by countries in the annual report questionnaire. So all of our countries have to submit this data to the UN. The problem with this data is that in a lot of countries, it's simply, based on site information, hospital admittances, those kinds of things. It's based on police data. And the challenge with the data, the metrics by which we measure country performance, is that essentially all they're looking at is arrests, its seizures, its number of drug market operations interrupted. And what the metrics don't measure is the harm associated with enforcement. So there's real problems with the metrics. There's real problems with the validity of the metrics. But if we're to say, well, what is this driver? Well, we can use things like satellite and data technology, which helps us track increases in the amounts of cultivation. So the work of people like David Mansfield and Alsis really demonstrate this growth of ephedra cultivation in Afghanistan, which is fueling methamphetamine cultivation there. We can use that data and analysis, that kind of geographical satellite data for places like Colombia, for cannabis cultivation. We can use police seizure data, but the real challenge when we have police seizure data is, that is then used to extrapolate assumed overall international market volumes, when we can never, truly demonstrate that that's the case. Things like the Global Drug Survey, the annual Global Drug Survey, are very, very useful and helpful in, demonstrating changes in drug patterns, national drug surveys. So there's lots of different information sources we can use. The problem, as you've highlighted, is none of them are exactly, purely empirical. But I think the key thing in terms of accounting for this global spread is we can track the changes in the nature of drugs that are available. We can track through, for example, EMCDDA reports, changes in prices and purity and changes in drug markets themselves. So the key thing is we have to work with multiple data sources. And I would argue that all of those data sources have pointed to an increase in the drugs market. So that's a very long way around your question. In terms of COVID and booming markets, I think the key thing that we've seen during COVID certainly has been an increase in online drug market sales. Jennifer, I don't know whether you've got information on that. Certainly people who previously would probably never have bought drugs online did buy drugs online during COVID. That kind of research has been very well tracked. I think the other key challenge we saw during COVID, there were some good things that happened during COVID. For example, people were able to get opiate substitution therapy, methadone, without having to daily report to pharmacies. They were able to have consultations over Zoom and things like that. So we saw good things and positive things actually finally happening there. And I think the other key challenge we saw during COVID, Jennifer, again, decline of some of these traditional party drugs. MDMA markets certainly went through the floor. But also at the same time, I think we saw more kind of friendship group based dealing during COVID. People kind of really, you know, weren't relying on public street dealing anymore, relying more on friendship networks in order to obtain their drugs of choice. And Jennifer, if there's anything you want to add to that.
Yes, I'm going to put in the chat in a wee second a paper by have you ever come across Francisco Thumes? He's a Colombian researcher, and he wrote this brilliant paper called "Let's All Guess the Size of the Drug Market." And he was part of the UNODC, the UN Office of Drugs and Crime. So he's speaking as someone who's compiled those statistics. And there are real problems with them. And I think there are also kind of gendered issues with that recording. So they tend to record who's present when a drug is seized. So women are kind of, there's a high probability of women being kind of caught up in this. So if there are drugs in their home, I think we also know that women's involvement in drug trafficking often involves holding drugs for other people. So they may be seized, they may be seen as the person who's responsible for the drug when actually they are in reality a low-income person who's allowing their house to be used for drug storage, if they know that that's what's being stored there. There was a paper by Rosa Del Olmo, Venezuelan criminologist, who was one of the first to write about drug mules, and she talks about this problem. So she's not talking about drug mules, she's talking about a mixed group. Actually, she involves international drug trafficking and local selling, but she talks about this problem of women being apprehended because they're the ones who open the door, which is great. So these statistics have kind of particular biases in them as well, I think. Right. Okay, so COVID and changing drug markets. It's really difficult because we don't know a huge amount about what people were buying online before COVID anyway. So we've not got a decent baseline, right? And this is a really big problem. If we want to talk about changes in women's involvement, we don't have a huge amount of research. So it's not like we can say, oh, look, we can compare with this study in the 1970s and look, there are these changes. Actually, the data that we have is so scant that it is very hard to talk about gender change. I think with COVID changes, there has definitely been more people buying online. Release have done a brilliant piece of work. They've done a survey asking people about their drug purchases during COVID, and their interim report is available. And they track different changes in people's drug use, and also they track people's availability of harm reduction. And actually, we're trying to do a gendered analysis of that. And one of the findings that's coming out is actually women have a much harder time accessing harm reduction during COVID. I think because my kind of theory on this really is that because of that gendered stigma, when women are at home with other people, it's much harder for them to access counselling, or, you can't just receive equipment by post if you're living in a household with other people who don't know about your drug use, for example. So online drugs, but I think there are different things that have sort of been happening in tandem, right? I think there's the COVID lockdown effect of people being bored at home or being super stressed at work, or actually not being able to access legitimate medical care, right? So if you're suffering from anxiety and you're being told that you can't see a GP, I can completely understand why people would, for example, go to an e-pharmacy online to order Valium or other types of antidepressants, right? So I think the phenomenon of people buying drugs during COVID, I think, is really multifaceted. And I think it's also coincided with the huge, I'm not going to say movement online, because I think that suggests there's an offline business which has gone online. And I think it's way more complicated than that, actually. But there has been a huge opening up, we can say, of availability of drugs online. I was at a conference last week, and it was, I think, a Belgian project looking at online drug markets, and often the online business was attached to a completely legitimate business. So it's not people who would previously have been selling drugs on the street now setting up a website. It's actually a company who was previously interested in import-export of boxing equipment, now diversifying into selling steroids, for example. So the COVID and online drug markets, I think there are really big changes. But I think we should always pay attention to those continuities as well, right? I think it's too easy to assume that these big technologies mean that the drug business is making there will be huge leaps and changes. I think a lot of this is really huge continuities. Like Julia, you were talking before about the relationship between global north and global south. So in, these overarching trends of who is able to buy drugs and who finds themselves producing it, usually, being paid a pittance, there is huge continuity. Right. So I guess that's where I will stop talking.
I will ask you to follow up on a couple of things. So one is kind of briefly, do you think these COVID changes have had much of a gender dimension you can pick up on? And then after that, maybe you could follow up again on a point Julia mentioned earlier before then I kind of chucked things off course about whether the greater emphasis on prohibition in prison and your views and your research findings on the gendered nature of that.
Let me have a go at the first part about the gender changes. It's so hard to know, right? We don't have a decent baseline. The data that we have on what's happened to women during COVID lockdowns is really scant. So at the minute I'm working with Release, we had an intern this summer doing analysis of their drugs in the time of COVID reports. We're trying to do a gendered analysis there because a third of the responses to that are by women, but we're also finding a lot of responses by trans individuals as well, which is brilliant, right? It's brilliant to see them represented in the sample, and I think it says a lot about the work that Release do in terms of making sure that their work speaks to diverse communities. But especially with the trans community, we do not know what they've been doing before. So when they're talking, in the survey, there are questions like, is it harder to access drugs or more easy to access drugs since lockdown? We don't know what it is that they're referring to. We don't know whether they're talking to recreational drugs. We don't know whether these are people with long-standing heroin addictions, or they might be referring to hormone treatments, or they might be referring to their medications that they would normally get from a doctor. We just don't know. So I think there's a real problem with lack of data, I think. And I think it's also not possible to speak of women as a group. Right. So we can think about trans women as a particular group. But within that data, there are lots of young women who are students, and there are also older women who are carers. And their reasons for using drugs during lockdown or seeking out drugs during lockdown are so different. So we've got one quote from one woman saying, drugs are really helping me manage the pandemic. I'm so stressed that I couldn't manage without them. And that was a woman who was in her 30s who works full time. And then there's also another one saying, drugs are really helping me get along with my family much better. And this is a young woman who's in her 20s, who's a student. And so they're both using more drugs, apparently during the pandemic, but I think in both cases, cannabis actually. But the reasons that they're using them and what it means to them and how that relates to the impacts of the pandemic are so different. And there was a question earlier asking about disability as well. And I think that's also a really good question to ask about women who have disability. We don't know very much about them and how they are relating to these drug markets. And I think in terms of disability, we can think very amply about that in terms of neurodiversity, but also physical disability. And it may be the case that online drug markets are opening up really, products that can help people enhance their lives. And I think it's important always to keep an eye on the fact that this category of drugs is so extraordinarily large. And we see, it's not just about drugs, seeing drugs as harmful, but also seeing drugs as something that can be necessary, that can be life affirming, that can be helping people deal with different things. I don't know. I'm going to say one more thing, but I think with people having so much time on their hands, some of the release data, we can see people experimenting with like psychedelic drugs. There's also this kind of renaissance in psychedelic drugs happening right now, and kind of tied to wellness, which is this whole other dimension. And I think there are just these really huge shifts happening right now, and it's really hard to speak about how they affect women, because women as a group are not homogenous, right? We're different from one another.
Yeah, I might actually ask you a couple of things on that. So it seems that you're kind of tentatively suggesting that the COVID period might have accelerated and moved to more online dealing, although yeah, you're not saying that street dealers are moving online, but more drugs are available online. So away from the gender field, it's been suggested that this change in drug dealing changes the type of person who can succeed in drug dealing. You no longer need to be hardened to use violence if you're kind of in a house and nobody knows where you are, if you've kind of encrypted your laptop and your messaging apps well enough, then nobody needs to know who you are. So, you could be sending tremendous weights of drugs while you order them online and you sell them online and nobody ever knows who you are. And another thing is it has changed the experience of buying drugs. There's been a time when to buy drugs, people either, unless they knew a friend, they'd have to go to a dodgy area of town and find someone on a street corner and possibly put themselves at risk. Then the advent of the mobile phone meant it changed that instead people phone or text a number, someone arrives at them and it perhaps feels a bit less risky. And then it's clearly the drug buying and receiving experience is different again. When you order it online, either you
cut off in his prime.
I was wondering if it was just me. Let's hold on a few seconds and I hope he comes back again.
But maybe, Jennifer, while we're waiting, though, I think it's also just really important. Oh, are you back, James?
Oh, was it me?
Carry on, Julia. I'm going to get James to reconnect, okay?
Okay, I was just going to say, Jennifer, it's also, while there has been a lot of attention to what's happening with online drug markets and online drug sales, it's not an either or. I mean, this kind of cyber market changes are really impacting only a very, very small number of people in a very few countries, which are, advanced industrial economies. I mean, we're not seeing it kind of impacting in the same way globally. And this is alongside, as you mentioned before, the kind of continuities. So it's alongside still the increase in raw, kind of organic plant materials, opium poppy, coca, these kinds of things. So it's not that kind of dualism in the way it's sometimes presented. It's just, I think what we're trying to articulate here is a more complex and dense and more diversified market than we've ever had before. And that is in part also because of the growth of these online markets.
Definitely. And I think, the way you talked about globalization before, I think is super important. So a lot of the online markets are often connected to kind of transnationalized markets. So, for example, people buying modafinil can get them; they will arrive by post from India or Singapore. And I think what we think of as a drug market has really expanded and changed and take on these different shapes. And increasingly, I think, sort of occupy more legal grey areas, right? So with the traditional drugs, they fit in a very clear prohibitive, the sort of prohibition regime, whereas being able to, these e-pharmacies benefit from legal loopholes that mean that drugs can be legally sent from one part of the world to the other in small quantities. So there's just huge complexity, isn't there? I mean, more to study and more to think about than ever before, I think. Yeah, they're complicated things. Is James back? Nearly. We can see him almost back with us.
I thought he was back. Oh, here he is.
Here he is.
I'm gonna wait.
Yeah, someone's even talking about Bitcoin. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I thought
for another 2 hours and then 2 minutes.
So very quickly on Bitcoin, yes, there are dark markets and there are markets that use Bitcoin, but there are also huge amounts of drugs being sold on the clear net through just normal credit cards. And so there's this, big accessibility that means that people can get quite serious drugs, I think, online, and those have harms attached to them, right? There may be benefits to people, but there are also huge harms.
Because these are completely
obviously there's some gendered aspects to that as well, right?
It's just that unregulated market dilemma, though, isn't it? So, the downside of drug strategy, as far as the traditional narcotic drugs goes, is that if you take these drugs, you do so at your own risk, and if you die of toxic overdose, then that's your own fault for breaking these kind of laws around drug control. It's quite unprecedented to have a policy area where the price of your deviance from law is that you may actually lose your own life in that respect. But I think that kind of notion of lack of regulation is also bleeding into some of these other clear net drug markets, where again, it's these challenges of regulation. It's not something that's state-based regulation. These are transnational, internationalized phenomena. So what jurisdiction do we actually operate in? And I think an interlinked challenge with that is the way that this has been addressed has been through traditional law enforcement, closing down sites, shutting down web dealers. The other aspect has been trying to limit the amount of chemical precursors that are available in order to kind of manufacture these substances. But the challenge is, as we've seen in all aspects of drug control over the last century of pursuing this strategy, is that all this simply does is just scatter. It's called the balloon effect, isn't it? It just scatters, who's producing different types of precursors. This is what we've seen in, the MDMA markets. I mean, we impose very, very tough restrictions on precursor chemicals to manufacture MDMA or methamphetamine. And basically, chemical innovation means that new forms of chemical precursors are developed and invented. So it's just this, Dave Bewley-Taylor calls it whack-a-mole, doesn't he? We're just, enforcement's just constantly chasing these problems around. Sorry, James.
Thank you very, very much for continuing the chatter while I had to give up on the Wi-Fi that was up and down. So I'm now hotspotting from my phone, and hopefully this is reliable. So I guess we'll move on. So that sounded like when I was actually successfully online, discussion of changing markets, about, I guess, the benefits and, I guess, anarchic downsides of how unregulated things are when they end up online. So maybe I'll move back then to the second question that I'd asked you, Jennifer, is and we heard more Julia said there about, that whenever the powers that be decide to enhance prohibition, do more arresting, more punishing, ban more things, that essentially people find a way around them and the amount of drugs available don't go down. And, it seems if they're getting cheaper and they're getting higher quality, the things we're doing are not working. So now we'll talk about maybe more of the other downsides to it. And again, back to the gender. So what do you specifically, Jennifer, how is this ramping up of the war on drugs, of punishments, of enforcement activity? How has that impacted women specifically, would you say?
Okay. So I think between the 1990s and maybe 2005, let me say, I think in that period, the number of women who were in prison for drug offences almost doubled across Latin America, but also like North America and Europe. And there were a number of really great reports on this huge jump in women. But I think there are also kind of diversified effects here. So there are different things going on. In the prison that I was working in Ecuador, that number doubled because Ecuador was in a bilateral agreement, an international political agreement with the United States of America, where Ecuador agreed to arrest twice as many drug traffickers. So they pitched up at the airports, put some extra soldiers there, turned out some bags, found some people who were carrying drugs. But they also swept up anyone who was using drugs. They swept up street drug users. And there was one law, so they could all be tried as drug traffickers. Great. So that's the particular situation. Whereas in the UK, since 2005, the number of people who've been arrested at the border as drug mules has fallen dramatically because the National Crimes Agency have changed their priorities. They're not interested in numbers anymore. They're more interested in getting 1 or 2 big seizures a year, ideally with a boat in it, because that looks great on Twitter. So there are these different strategies going. So actually, In the UK, the number of women who are in prison for drug trafficking has kind of reduced massively. But then if we look also at the use of the death penalty for drugs offences, that has changed also. So I think since about 2014, actually, we've seen places like the Philippines, oh, my geography is rubbish here, Philippines and Indonesia suddenly started executing people for drug offences, and a portion of those are women. Not super high, but a portion of them are, but there are also people who are uniformly foreign, actually. So the people from West Africa and Brazil have been executed in Southeast Asia for drug trafficking offences. And there are questions about the extent to which they have mental impairments and disabilities that impair their judgment to understand what they're doing. There was a British man, whose name I've forgotten, who was arrested in China for drug trafficking, and he thought he was there on a record contract, and he was executed. So I think there have been increases, but I think it's not a uniform position. I think we have to pay attention to what's happening with individual countries and their policies, because I think Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, if I'm right, his war on drugs has been absolutely brutal. Extrajudicial executions of people in the thousands, and it's really like eye-watering stuff. I mean, there's kind of different mechanisms in play here, but I think in general it's that attitude of thinking if we just arrest enough people, especially those who are coming from the global south, or ideally in the global south, get them to stay there. That's kind of been the way of dealing with it, and it has gendered effects, of course, inevitably, because women are concentrated in those more lower levels or peripheral levels of the drug trade, so they might occupy positions that make them more vulnerable to being arrested. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much for that. So I'll ask you a couple of follow-ups on that. So firstly, I will ask you, is there any evidence to suggest that women's involvement in the drug trade is increasing, or is it simply a policing effect that, there's no evidence of more involvement, you're simply that there's more policing, so there's more women arrested, more in prison?
Yeah, great question. I mean, there is this assumption that somehow women's involvement in the drug trafficking is increasing, but people have been claiming that for like 100 years. And it's a bit of a red herring, I think. It tends to be also connected to anxieties about women's changing position in society. So there's that kind of connected. There were these big panics about women's involvement in opium in the 1920s in London, with particular celebrities being attached to that. Toby, what's her surname at Manchester University? Toby Seddon has written a lovely paper about that. There's also a very nice book by Elaine Carey, specifically looking at women's involvement in international drug trafficking across Latin America. And really, there have always been women involved in organizational roles. I think the assumption that women somehow have been lowly and stuck at home for all of history is not true. So there have been women involved in the drug trade for a very long time. There's a lack of good evidence about those people. The women that we know about are ones that kind of were notorious. So they are either they feature in sort of drugs enforcement agency files, or there's documentary evidence from them being arrested by local police. But there will have been thousands and thousands of women who've been involved in the drug trade in quite serious roles who we don't know anything about historically because they've never been arrested. So I think the idea that there are more women involved, I think, is incorrect, really. I've written a paper about this with a woman called Lindsay Laban. It's called this emancipation thesis. As women become emancipated, they will become involved in the drug business. And we kind of take another crack at that, looking at international research. So if you look at what women actually do internationally, it's not the case that women who receive an education and who can own property, who are more involved in the drug trafficking business. It's actually really much more varied than you would expect. And there are women in the global south who can and do take very leading roles. And there are places in the global north where women are extremely exploited in the drug business. So it's kind of a complex picture, I guess. Does that answer the question? Sorry, I think I've gone on a bit while you ramble there.
It does perfectly. And then I've got another, I'm afraid, yet another follow-up for you, which will then hand over to Julia. And one thing also to note, we have one really good question in the chat. I'm going to park it for now. I will definitely return to that later, but please do follow up, Pius, and put more questions in the chat. We'd love to hear the comments on what you're feeling about what you're hearing, and also any questions, anything you would like to ask Jennifer or Julia. But so Jennifer, again, if you say, can you say anything more about the roles that women take? So, like I say, there's the stereotype of perhaps women at the lowest and most exploited rungs, and then there's the other, the picture that crops up occasionally in your TV shows like Narcos or Cocaine Cowboys about the kind of the queen of cocaine who kills everyone who's near her and is, even more badass than the men. So can you tell us, from your research and understanding, is there any way to summarize the huge complexity in the roles that women compared to men take up in the drugs economy?
There's a wonderful paper by Tammy Anderson from 2005, and it's called something like Women's Power in the Drug Economy. And it's really brilliant because she kind of produces this framework for thinking about women's involvement. And what she kind of has this typology that I'm going to now try and remember, but one of them is that women fund drug habits. So they buy drugs for their people. So for example, women who are employed in sex work are often funding somebody else's, or maybe funding somebody else's drug habit. So that's they finance the drug habit. She also talks about the role of domestic power. So women, to different degrees, are often in charge of the domestic sphere, and this is a place where drugs might be cut up, stored, but also where people who use drugs might be. Women may allow their home space to be used by people who are using drugs. They may also be involved in the drug trade themselves. They may be selling, but I think there's this kind of huge role that women play in supporting the drug business in different ways, right? So they will cook food for people, they will house people. So for example, in the Moroccan Rif region, women's role in supporting cannabis cultivation often reflects really traditional gender ideologies, and that they're in charge of cooking the food and making the housing for the people who then go to the fields to look after the cannabis. So we might not think of that as an involvement, but that domestic labor is absolutely fundamental to making everything happen. So there are these kind of it's a really, really nice typology, but it invites us to think really amply about the ways that women, even if they're not directly involved, might also support the drug business. But there's just, I don't know, I'll give you a quick flyover, okay? So if we look at women in cannabis cultivation, there's this huge diversity. So in the UK, we tend to think about cannabis cultivation as something that's done by people who are extremely exploited, who are kind of locked inside cannabis farms and are not able to leave. They're victims of human trafficking. But actually, women who live in Amsterdam and cultivate cannabis, they are Vietnamese women, often have legal statuses, and they are involved in an organising role rather than a subordinate role. In Australia, women get involved in cannabis cultivation often through their own gambling debts, and it becomes a way for them to clear debts. Connected to a social, gambling is a social activity that's particular to the Vietnamese community. In California, women are involved in cannabis farms as trimmers, and they're specifically employed as women. So men who run cannabis farms will seek out women because they've worked out that women are less likely to rip them off, and they will pay them extra, often for them to undertake the work of trimming cannabis, to do it topless. They're paid extra. So there are these kind of, all these different dimensions of the ways that gender plays out are really varied. But I think even within Tammy Anderson's typology, we can kind of start to flesh out these different ways that women are involved. And I think the kind of things that we can look at always are the ways, what does gender mean locally? Right? What are the kinds of jobs that are deemed to be women's jobs locally? I think that's always part of it. It's also always contingent on, race, class, gender, religion, disability. These things are always already in play. And then we can think about the influence of drug policy in shaping the ways that drug business is organised so as to avoid detection. And then we can also think about the impact of globalisation and where a place is located in terms of these global circuits of drugs. So there are these different things in play. And that's a really complicated answer to what was a straightforward question. So apologies.
No, that's excellent. Thank you very, very much. And I don't know, Julia, have you got anything you can add on, any way to discuss, categorize, summarize the roles of women in drugs economies?
I got a bit distracted then by some of the really good questions in the chat. But I think, just picking up on a couple of points that Jennifer has made there, I think, we do have a real dearth of knowledge around women in the drug trade, because looking at women in the drug trade is not sexy. It's kind of, we're much focused to these kind of, Hollywood style tales about these drug kingpins, and that's the kind of thing that sells books in markets and airports and places like that. So it's not really been attractive, and research funding has not really encouraged us to look at women in drug markets, because much of the research grants and funding that's available is really to kind of strongly support enforcement-led responses. So that hasn't kind of encouraged that sophistication and more gendered analysis. The other reason we don't look at women in drug markets is because we don't talk about pleasure, and very little research actually funds research on pleasure. And we do, there is evidence that more women are using drugs for pleasurable experiences. There was a question that was in there before in the chat, I think from Shifa, saying, what kind of drug use are we talking about? And I think it's important, the UNODC acknowledges that around 80% of people who use drugs do so irregularly, on a moderate basis, and without significant harm to themselves. We can be moderate in drug use in much the same way as many people are moderate in their alcohol use. So I think the key thing is that people just have not really kind of been encouraged to look at the role of women in all women's diversities in the drug trade. And the problem that we have from this, I see some of the people on this call who have experience of working with women in drug treatments and rehabilitation services, is that when you make women invisible, you also make women's treatment needs invisible, and you also make programs which should more specifically address the challenges that women face. You also completely negate that. And in my research, when I was looking at drugs and development, is that these so-called alternative development programs, where basically you're trying to, encourage farmers not to be growing coca and instead to be growing apples or peppers or, something else that brings them back into the formal market, is women are not recognized as having cultivating roles. They're not seen as being heads of households, which in many of these contexts they are, because of outmigration, because of conflict, because of the feminization of poverty. So programs are simply not targeted at women's needs in the drug trade. The research is simply not being done on what women's roles are in the drug trade. And the net effect of that is that we see women excluded and made invisible in the provision of services, in their voices, and in their ability to advocate for the kinds of changes that women need to see in order for enforcement not to negatively impact them in the way that it has done. There is just one other point I would make here very quickly. And I think, again, trying to take more of a historical view on this, there was a very, very big change. A lot of people talk about the United Nations Drug Conventions. The 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs is usually seen as being the most important, because that was the kind of precursor to criminalization in all our countries. The 1988 UN Convention on illicit trafficking, I think, is probably the most important of the UN conventions, in part because of the timing in which it was introduced, but also because I think that is the root of this really heavy push towards this stronger enforcement drive in the 1990s onwards, including because it focused on criminalization of possession. And once you start criminalizing possession, that means that essentially a whole new reservoir of people are vulnerable to arrest and to incarceration. And I think that's exactly the trend that we saw in the 2000s. And this is why women have in particular been hoovered up in this mass incarceration trend, because the emphasis is not just on arresting and incarcerating the high level operatives, it's on those people who are at the bottom, what we call the low hanging fruit. And that's really being facilitated by these changes in international, the international obligations that are created by the treaties, but also policy diffusion. And Jennifer mentioned before the role of the United States. There's also a question in the chat about the UK, which we can come to in a minute. But policy diffusion, where the US, which is the world's leading incarcerator, this staggering increase in incarceration rates, has essentially sought to diffuse that policy response to partners in the global South, where the rule of law is infinitely weaker, where there is higher levels of corruption, and prisons are simply not capable of catering for the volume of people who are currently being incarcerated. So I think that kind of context that we have seen this shift towards tougher enforcement, and it does bring us back to the UK, because while a number of other countries around the world are now recognizing that we cannot carry on enforcing criminalization in the way that historically we have done since the 1960s, you know, I mean, like 60 years of following the same strategy. So we've got to look at other ways and other approaches. One country, to my mind, which is standing out right now for its failure to engage with those changes is the United Kingdom.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to ask you for some follow-ups on that. So firstly, can you tell us a bit more about the failure of the United Kingdom to get with the programme as you suggested? And then once you've done that, I wonder if you can say that this actually responds to the relates to the first question from Pius, who said, how is the UK planning to work with the EU and UN on drugs since Brexit? Surely losing EMCDDA and Europol impacts enforcement. And I will add to that further, that one is, anyone who's tried to get the police to investigate the theft of something like a bicycle will know they don't have time for such trifling matters anymore. And I can imagine some drug dealers might be thinking that the police are so overstretched that you'd have to kind of be an idiot to get arrested by them right now. I think the budget for chasing non-violent drug dealers must be very low. So I don't know if that's something you thought. And I'd wonder if internationally, you mentioned that there was an uptick in arresting, which Jennifer noted as well through the noughties, which also impacted women, more women being in prison. Are we going the opposite way, albeit by accident? Priorities have shifted away from the low-hanging fruit and simply the police don't have the time or money to go chasing drug dealers as much as they used to?
Jennifer, shall I start on that? I think I would disagree, although I would need to get up-to-date statistics to internationally verify that. But I think the challenge still remains that the metrics of drug control, because these emphasize arrests, these metrics, reporting metrics, continue to drive arrest for people for low-level, non-violent possession offences or supply offences. There is still that incentive within the overall national and international reporting system. So even though, you know, we have seen these arguments that, you know, the UK, where we've lost significant numbers of police, what that has done is it's meant that there's not the same kind of attention or prosecution of those kind of low-level drug offences. I actually think that is a more precarious situation because it really relies on the discretion of the police. So what we're seeing is kind of change in some jurisdictions by default of lack of policing capacity. But that is, as I said, that to me is really problematic because it can reinforce that bias, stereotyping and stigmatizing in policing anyway. So I wouldn't say it's an easy picture of arrests are going down by any stretch of the imagination. Just on the UK, we had a really interesting conference at Liverpool John Moores University the other day where I was actually comparing the UK drug strategy with the EU drug strategy. I think the UK coming out of the EU drug strategy portends really great ill for the UK because it means that we're no longer kind of subject to that oversight and peer review that was provided through organizations such as the EMCDDA, where you can see, you know, the kind of drug trend analysis for all countries in the European Union, European countries, including Turkey and Scandinavian countries. So it's taken us away from that peer review. Some of my research points to the fact that the British government was very much influenced by the idea that some of our main drug problems were coming in from places like Pakistan, which is very specific to the nature of our colonial history and the communities that we have in the UK. But Pakistan, for example, was seen as being the major threat and not, for example, cannabis coming in through Morocco and into Spain. So our drug priorities were seen to be quite different from European Union countries. I think this was a major mistake. We're looking at changes right now. Colombia, where we've just seen the election of Gustavo Petro, who is talking about introducing regulated coca markets and ending the war on drugs in Colombia. This is going to mean major change in diplomatic relations with other countries. And it's a change that the UK is just simply not positioned to deal with, I don't think, because we have come out of institutions such as COPOLAD. COPOLAD was the kind of bridging organization between the European Union countries and between Latin American partner countries. The UK is now withdrawn from these. So we're kind of, in my view, very much isolated in a dramatically changing global environment. And the opportunities that we've had in the UK, for reasons, you know, Jennifer might like to take forward, is that we have a Labour Party which has fundamentally failed to engage with drug policy as a driver of injustice and inequality. So we don't have the kind of pressure for change that we've seen in, you know, Switzerland, where decriminalisation came from a very, very conservative perspective, or Portugal, where they just come out of right-wing authoritarian rule. In the UK, we don't even have an opposition Labour Party which has the confidence or the courage or sense of social justice to address the necessary changes to our drug laws, which a conservative government has equally failed to address. You know, I mean, I was tweeting before that we can take radical, dramatic decisions when it comes to economic policy, but never radical, dramatic decisions when it comes to drug policy. And so ultimately, we've really squandered opportunities. The Carol Black report, which found that treatment services were simply not fit for purpose, but that report was not allowed to consider decriminalisation. The British government has been an absolute obstacle to the rollout of some really, really important harm reduction initiatives. Yesterday, we saw that a heroin-assisted treatment program run by Danny Ahmed in Middlesbrough has now lost its funding from the Conservative Crime Commissioner. So we've seen chances really squandered, and I think that this is really, really deeply problematic. But the key challenge is Scotland, and Scotland is doing some really interesting and innovative things in response to its record levels of drug death. So what we have is not just a political crisis in the UK, record levels of drug deaths here, but also a brewing constitutional crisis. So I would say UK drug strategy is in a really quite serious mess right now, if I'm to be completely honest.
I went to have a, thank you, Julia. That gave me time to very quickly look up the statistics on drug arrest offences. Sorry, drug arrests for drug offences in the UK. And the picture is not one of huge variation. Basically, in 2015, it was about 73,000, and then it dipped a bit, and now we're back at 72,000. So it's a picture of like more or less rumbling along at the same rate. I mean, it's really strange, isn't it? You would think that the police may want to redirect their attention from drug offences. But I mean, we saw during lockdown that the number of stop and searches for drugs skyrocketed. It went up by 1/3 in London, despite the fact that people were mostly at home. It was very strange, and there was a feeling that the police took that as an opportunity to apparently crack down on drug use or drug possession or drug markets. So there were many things that they could have focused on that time, but that was one of them. So I'm not sure. I mean, there's an interesting question about whether there's political will amongst the police to trouble themselves with drug possession. And I think across England and Wales, there's huge variation. I think there are some local policing agencies who've kind of de facto stopped searching for drugs. And there are others who are putting in place diversion schemes where people can have like a deferred prosecution agreement. The Crown Prosecution Service don't like this because it causes real problems in terms of parity. So what does it mean if in one part of England and Wales, if you're arrested, the police will basically say, please don't do it again and we won't charge you, whereas in other ones you would be charged straight away or given a caution. So that's that question. I think I'm kind of slightly disappointed in the Conservative Party as well, if I'm honest, right? It seems to me, I mean, I've been invited to events at Parliament that when you dig into the details, they're by lobbying agents we're being lobbied by companies who are poised to set up a legal cannabis business. Like these companies are ready, they exist, and they are putting pressure on Parliament. And I'm slightly surprised that the Conservatives haven't been swayed by the argument that we should legalise cannabis just as is happening in the United States and in other parts of Europe, precisely because it would be a major source of tax revenue. And it would be a major reduction in policing and work done by the Crown Prosecution Service. I mean, we see the courts absolutely on their knees. They are not able to deal with the number of cases that are happening, and not having to deal with cannabis possession would in a heartbeat get rid of a huge number of those cases. So even from a far right position, well, even a right wing position, there are logics that could be, you know, there is a case to be made for legalizing cannabis in particular, as one that we've just seen these big changes with everywhere. I mean, it's also worth remembering that it was Margaret Thatcher who funded harm reduction in the 1980s. prompted by the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and that was not out of any kind of left-wing concern for people. Rather, she saw a kind of economic case that had to be made for managing this as effectively as possible to reduce the spread of infectious diseases. So I would lay the blame not only at the Labour, but I would also lay the blame with the Conservative Party as well.
Thank you very much for that. And I'd also echo that, yeah, I think I surprised people by suggesting I'd expect drug policy change to be more likely from the Conservative parties, as oddly enough, it suits many of their instincts, that the kind of turning anything into a business, marketizing anything. And I think the libertarian element that certainly of the kind of the chums of Boris Johnson, etc., came of age in the 1980s at a time when drug use was proliferating. I'd say, you know, the front bench cabinet, your Osborne, Gove, Johnson era, I refuse to believe they have not and do not recreationally use drugs. Certainly there's video sequences of Gove and Osborne where they look like they haven't slept in about 2 weeks with their eyes going in different directions in Parliament. So I kind of did expect there might be change, but I guess they are frightened of the electorate, and it will probably have it as a policy when it becomes a vote winner, I guess. So I think, did you have something you wished to chime back in there, Jennifer?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
I'm always one for chiming back in, but I think, you know, the point that, because there was a question in there about availability of cannabis, medical cannabis in the Q&A, and, you know, this being a human rights issue in terms of the right to appropriate treatment, and, you know, and what we have to understand in terms of the real mess that the UK is in right now is that we are one of the world's leading exporters of medical cannabis. We have a thriving biotech cannabis industry here. We're one of the world's leading re-exporters of cocaine. We're one of the world's leading exporters of opiates, but all for the licit, legal medical markets. And, you know, the point that you make about the vested interest in this, you know, I mean, Tate and Lyle, Victoria Aitken, who was previously a Home Office minister in charge of drugs, but had to recuse in terms of any questions on drugs because her husband himself was involved in one of the largest cannabis biotech sectors. So we have this, you know, Paul Kenwood, thank you. So I think, you know, we just have this national schizophrenia almost around our drug strategy, that we are exporting medical cannabis overseas, that we are actively preventing people from being prescribed in the UK. And a lot of that comes back to, you know, Joe Neal might have something to say on this as well, but also just this lack of training for nurses, for clinicians, for social workers. You know, drug policy just is not mainstreamed either in our teaching, practitioner development, or a national debate in the way that it is in other more advanced, mature countries. Sorry for the rant.
Thank you.
Philip May.
It was an excellent one, thank you. Anything to add on that, Jennifer? I do have another question. So the next one, you've taken me very, very well to one of the bullet points from the flyer, and that is, okay, so how would you go about reducing the harms caused by the war on drugs, caused by drugs economies? So what would you do? Any of you have solutions you would like to stand upon your soapbox and tell us about?
I mean, I'm going to go for the Conservative option. I'm going to start with that, which is say, I think proportional sentencing reform. So sentences that proportionally reflect what a person has actually done, I think would be reasonable. So we have some of the harshest punishments actually for, and I'm talking here really about drug selling and drug trafficking. We have some of the harshest punishments that I know of. We have people serving long sentences of up to 12 years. People who are categorized by judges as being of a minor role are still being sentenced up to 12 years, which is longer than you would take for a very, very serious violent offence, including manslaughter or murder. So these are really, really disproportionate. So for me, even keeping the whole system intact, I think there's a very strong case to just have punishments that actually reflect the crime. And I would want to see that in the UK, and I want to see it overseas as well. The idea that people are executed for their involvement in the drug trade, I think, is a rank injustice. I don't, you know, even in states where they want to have I'm losing my words. Even in states where they want to have capital punishment, it's hard to see how involvement in the drug business is on a par with terrorist or other violent offences. So this is the most conservative possible case for reform, which is saying, let's look at punishing people much less than we are just now. And again, there's a real conservative argument here, which is jail is really expensive, prison is really expensive. Why are we sending people to prison for such long periods when we know either it doesn't work, or in the case of people who are involved in a very minor way, such as drug meals, they probably wouldn't do it again anyway. They're kind of non-violent, non-criminally involved people anyway. So that's the lowest hanging fruit. I'm gonna pass over to Julia, I think, for the next possibility.
Before Julia, I will add a comment or two there. So yeah, no, completely agree. I'm very interested, and whether Julia might even, or you or Julia might have an answer to this, is whether this kind of more conservative approach to bringing a more humane and sane element to sentencing is perhaps the lowest hanging fruit. Since I guess I struggle to think of a time when I've seen a law change that a sentence has got lower. You know, people who change the law are very good at increasing the sentencing guidelines, less so reducing them. And so part of me thinks, well, maybe our best chance is actually ripping the whole thing down rather than tinkering with it in a downward direction. But then also agree that this is an absolute rank injustice, the idea that people are executed for drug offences. I've been back in the UK a year now, but for 2 years before that, I was living in Singapore, which is, sadly a world leader in such things. They execute between 10 and 15 drug dealers a year, and that can be, you need to have, I think, a kilogram of cannabis or an ounce of heroin or an ounce of cocaine. And Singapore, it's now I don't live there anymore. I'll more freely say that it's ethnically targeted as well. There is very specific racial profiling of ethnic Malays, both at the borders and in the country. But I would say for hope though that in that region, Malaysia still have capital punishment on the books for drug offences. There's a moratorium of use for it. So hopefully there might be some positive contagion in the region as it becomes more of a norm to see capital punishment. But secondly, offers, I guess, near-time conservative vision for reducing the harms of.
I kind of lost you then, James. Was that a comment or a question? You kind of went into some kind of Scooby-Doo.
Sorry, it was a question basically, really follow up from Jennifer, not me. Okay, what would be your approach to reducing the harms of the drug markets and the war on drugs?
Okay, so I think we just need to, have realistic and evidence-led conversations, and we have to stop understanding the drug trade as something that's separate from the formal economy, both historically and into the current period. As Jennifer said before, informal illicit drug markets and formal economies merge into complex grey areas. So it's not a question of good and bad. It's not a question of illicit economies and formal economies. We have an international political economy, which was historically driven by the drug trade and which continues to be driven by the drug trade. And what we've created as a result of criminalization through the United Nations drug conventions, and that's why I'm, an irrational maximalist, because I don't think we can actually have reform within the current UN system. I think that's the real challenge. But what we've tended to see is that this idea of tinkering at the edges, bricolage, that you can kind of moderate the policy paradigm from within, is really, really problematic. And you can see this, I have, PhD students at the moment who are doing some really interesting work and looking at places like Canada, where on the one hand, you can have regulated markets, legalization as such, but at the same time, a really intense and securitized response to trafficking offenses. Bolivia did exactly the same, legalized, regulated the coca markets, but got very, very tough on trafficking offences, with prison sentences that were higher for rape and probably even murder. So where we have seen relaxation of drug laws, well, not relaxation, reform of drug laws, we've also seen a toughening, because these states are having to kind of justify themselves in an international arena. And the easiest way to say that is, well, we're taking these measures locally at the domestic level because we're reducing harm, but we are still abiding by our international commitments to cooperate in eliminating illicit traffic. It was called the William Brownfield Doctrine. The former US ambassador to Afghanistan and Colombia devised it. We can be a mosaic and patchworks of different levels of domestic drug regulation, but we all have to work together to fight the, this evil, bigger international trade. And it's a completely incoherent positioning, in my opinion. And you cannot have the kind of reforms that are needed while you're tinkering with this within the same paradigm. So the key things I would just mention here, James, are we just need some better financial evaluation of current enforcement-led strategies. And what we also need are for police services to be doing evaluations, impact analysis, outcomes assessments of drug enforcement operations. Because what we see time and time again, as most people will know listening to this, is that large-scale seizures simply leave a vacuum, which then leads to violence and more people then competing for that market share. So police authorities, instead of just tweeting about seizure successes, should also be committing resources to analysing what the impacts are of drug enforcement operations, both in terms of potential violence that results from competition for market share, but also the dangers that arise from breaking supply chains where those supply chains are trusted and known. So what you're essentially doing when you disrupt this supply is you're putting people back into an unregulated market and breaking up those kind of bounds of trust, which bring health risks and really serious dangers. So proper financial evaluation. We need to be lobbying for a change in metrics. We also have to move away from this narrative that people can recover from drug dependence and addiction. Okay, we have this really heavily abstinence-driven agenda here, which is completely unrealistic because abstinence simply does not work for all people. So we need to be changing both the kind of discourse that we use in these debates, but also the types of treatments that are available for people. And this is why the harm reduction emphasis here is so important, but it's very difficult to deliver that within a paradigm of criminalization. And the final change that really we do need to see is one where we start to address the structural issues, the structural drivers of people's engagement with the drug trade, of why people are using drugs. And these can be for recreational purposes, or they can be for other reasons. But the challenge is, as I said right at the beginning, as long as we have this kind of whack-a-mole, send in the police, kick down the doors, seize the drugs, imprison these people, all this has done is create the world's largest illicit economy and an organized crime system, which challenges the capacity and the coherence of states around the world. It's an absolute feeder for corruption. It encourages corruption in policing. It encourages corruption of the state. And it's just a war that can never, ever be won. You can't have a war on drugs, just like you can't have a war on chairs. You can't have a war on an inanimate object. And we need mature policy responses.
Okay, that is excellent. Thank you very much. So I think we can start to tie up. And so I've got some more questions I will run through, unless either of you wish to follow up on the grand solutions advocated. Oh yeah, you have a question, Joe?
No, sorry, Julia, because you asked about the lack of education for drugs. You mentioned that earlier. And you're absolutely right. And, I teach in science and pharmacy, and there's a complete lack of any, in that curriculum, the undergraduate curriculum, there's a complete lack of education about drug policy and failings and harm reduction. Medical cannabis, I teach that to the final years. That's the first thing that they've heard about cannabis. Medical psychedelics, Jennifer, you talked about the beneficial effects of many illegal drugs. And that's, of course, something that we're trying to change UK drug policy on. And as you say, Jennifer, again, we've been to Parliament, and the economic argument for that is extraordinary. But you're right, Julia, sorry to go back to that. The education is seriously lacking. With drug science, we're trying to bring that into the curriculum. I'm guessing there's more drug policy education, in criminology and the kind of courses that you guys are teaching on. But in science, it's very, very poor, and we absolutely need to change that. And then in psychiatry, medical cannabis, psychedelics will be coming into psychiatry, and we absolutely need to educate the doctors, nurses, pharmacists, all of the healthcare professionals, as well as general public and everybody. So that is a huge concern. And as academics, I think it's up to us to try and change this. And to get it into the curriculum. Mm-hmm. Anyway, thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah. A sort of a final note is I heard a great paper by a guy called Damien Zeitch, who's written about drug trafficking, and it's in Spanish, but he talks about dialing down violence as a central focus. So when we think about how do we respond to the drug business, the question of dialing down violence can be a leading principle. So, for example, Joe, when you're talking about education, there's so much stigma and misunderstanding, and tackling those is a way of dealing with the violence that's faced by people in the drug market, by the fact that they need to keep their drug use secret, that they, pregnant women don't feel comfortable disclosing drug use when they go to see a midwife for fear of surveillance or losing care of children. And so for me, I find that a really useful principle. It's one that makes us reframe the use of the death penalty, for example, of like, well, this is a form of state violence against people. The use of stop and search as a form of, intrusive, searching of people's bodies, and particularly people who are racialized, and especially young Black men. So I think there is a way forward, really, but I think it really demands that we rethink all the assumptions in play here, and how we respond.
Yeah, and absolutely. And when you talk to young people who are at university and you explain, the importance of harm reduction, and actually to students coming in, who are going to be using drugs, they have to be kept safe, responsible. They do understand it, and they really get it when you explain it, but they do have the misconceptions. And when I talk about psychedelics and the importance of psychedelic medicine, academics say to me, you can't do that, they're hugely dangerous. And so the stigma and it's 50 years, isn't it, of well, over 50 years now, of stigma and misinformation, and people just have this sort of intrinsic bias now, and we're kind of working against that, I guess.
So while we tie up, we've got a few more questions, if it's all right to go through and ask them. So we've got one. I think these will be quite quick fire with the time that we've got left. So quickly, does anyone of you, so JM has asked about Uruguay's regulation. I guess they'll be talking about the major change there, unless there's others which I don't know about, is creating a government-run cannabis economy. So basically that although there's other ways to get it, the government ask farmers to grow cannabis and then they sell it out of government licensed shops. Jennifer or Julia, do you have a view on this policy?
Jennifer, you want to fire away?
Yeah, I mean, does it reduce violence related to the drug market? Probably. And I think we know we're not aiming for perfection here. I think less violence is a very good outcome, right? So for sure, there are going to be problems here. We can't rule out exploitation happening in those cannabis farms, for example. We can't rule out the fact that people are probably being not paid properly. This is not fair trade, social enterprise type solution. But if it's one that reduces stigma, reduces violence, then that's a very good start, doesn't it?
I think what's interesting about Uruguay as well is that it really demonstrates there's such a spectrum of reform options that we have. I mean, it doesn't have to just be, either full legalization and unbridled markets or punishment and criminalization. There's lots of different ways. Canada, we're talking about now, legalized cannabis cultivation for medical markets in contexts such as Albania, Montenegro, Jamaica, Thailand with their medical cannabis reforms there. So there's a spectrum of different options that we can be looking at. Apart from the UK, obviously, which is refusing to look at most of these. But I think what's important here is it's also a development opportunity. Because if we say that, we're going to allow Morocco, for example, to participate in legitimate, regulated, legal, global cannabis supply markets, or Albania, then what this allows us to do is actually address people's development needs. I was doing some work in South Africa, and people in South Africa who were involved in the cultivation of cannabis weren't doing it, because they were trying to make illicit profits for a flash card. They were doing it to pay for children's school shoes. They were doing it to pay for school uniforms. There is a very important development question here. And the real challenge that we have with kind of moving forward with these twin tracks of policy reform is that we're kind of actually excluding from potentially future authorized cannabis markets those countries in the global south, which for nearly a century have been prevented and suppressed and suffered, pretty intense military repression in order to stop them cultivating. So we're really we've got a really serious development dilemma here as well. But I think Uruguay here really highlights to us that there are many different ways forward for looking at these kinds of reforms. Cannabis is a plant. And what we learn in the UK is you can stop cannabis coming into the UK, but all this does is simply move people to domestic cannabis cultivation with genetically modified seeds, hydroponic kits, and you're creating stronger and more potent cannabis, higher levels of THC with no regulation. It is an appalling policy.
Thank you very much. Julia, I don't know if you had anything specific or more. Oh no, you'd already spoken on that, Jennifer. So actually I'll move on to another question, which I think was directed to Julia in the chat, which would be, I am wondering if you have any comments about Captagon and how Syria and Lebanon are becoming narco states. Captagon, which is an amphetamine type stimulant, has a big role in crippling a country's economy.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of the concept of a narco state. I have to say, I think it doesn't really fully represent the different interests that there may be in certain types of illicit markets. So I'd move away from the terminology of a narco state. The Captagon markets, essentially, I mean, who are the key buyers in the Captagon markets? It's Saudi Arabia, it's the Gulf states. Lebanon has been one of the leading suppliers of Captagon to markets in Saudi Arabia, and that has overwhelmingly been because of economic crisis and serious structural crisis in Lebanon. So we can look at Syria, where there's conditions of conflict and drug manufacture is constantly being associated with the financing of wars and conflicts. But the reality is that even if you take those drugs out of those wars and conflicts still carry on. So it doesn't, you know, I mean, for the last 20, 30 years, there's been this really strong emphasis in academia. You know, we saw this in terms of Afghanistan, get rid of the opium, and then you will be staunching the supply of resources to the Taliban. Well, not really, because that's not really how they made their money. So, you know, and it was the same narrative around the FARC in Colombia. And you can take the drugs out of that equation, but either belligerent states or insurgents will raise revenues for conflict from other sources. So the swelling of the Captagon markets, you know, this increase in Captagon markets, I would say is demand-led. It requires Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states to actually have more coherent and human rights and clinically based drug policy responses. And that's simply kind of sidelining this off and saying this is another manifestation of, you know, a rogue state in Syria really doesn't necessarily help us to understand the role that drugs play in these dynamics. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. Don't know if you have anything on that, Jennifer, at all? Nope. In which case we are moving towards the end. There was one question about the importance of the 1971 misuse of drugs. Actually, no, I will ask that. So about the importance of the 1971 Misuse Drugs Act and the 2016 Psychoactive Substances Act. Earlier, I think Julia had mentioned the importance of kind of global treaties and their importance. So do you have a view on the necessity of reforming the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act and the 2016 Psychoactive Substances Act? Or do you think the bigger issues are upstream in international obligations?
Well, I'll jump in before Jennifer. I think we have to seriously and immediately address the failures of the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act, which were very much replicated in the 2016 Psychoactive Substances Act, which is just, you know, very much more of the same, whack-a-mole. So that has to be a priority because there is an urgency in this country right now to getting harm reduction measures in place, to understanding that we are facing a situation where, you know, powdered cocaine, one of the most, you know, significant drivers of drug overdose, benzodiazepines, of drug death in the UK, England, Wales, and Scotland. You know, we have a very serious issue here, and that cannot be dealt with within the current framework, to my mind, of the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act, or within this government's current drug strategy. If any of you saw, I see Vicky Beers on the call here, Vicky, the statement, the paper that came out from Priti Patel's Home Office on how the government will deal with possession-related offences is extraordinary in its arcane reading of what the actual problem is in this country. It's really, you know, for me, it's an absolute priority that we get help and we get support and we get treatment and we get services to a front line, which is desperately failing because of the crisis that we have in the NHS, the crisis we have in terms of funding, and the crisis of austerity. And unless we start addressing like what has to be, Vicky's put here, the paper is so anti-evidence based, it's untrue. And exactly, I mean, how on earth can we be like associated with these kinds of publications? So absolutely the priority has to be reforming domestic drug legislation, because that will have immediate effects. It's also about lobbying for improvements in the allocation of funding to these services. But for me, the bigger issue is changes to the international system. But, you know, changes to the international system are quite a difficult thing to achieve, aren't they? I think at the minimum right now, it's about getting the UK on the right side of evidence-based, science-led, human rights-led policy.
Beautifully put, Julia. Thank you. I just agree with everything you've said.
Okay, that is wonderful. So I think I don't think there's any more questions there I have seen to ask. After kind of the more of the comment variety of comments. So I don't know, Julia or Jennifer, if you have any closing remarks you would like to make before we say goodbye to everyone.
Just be in touch if you want to be in touch. And, you know, it's great to see so many students also on this call, because we really do need a generation that really understands the challenges that we face. So thank you ever so much for joining us. And thank you, James and Drug Science, for hosting us today. And lovely to see you, Jennifer and Joe.
Great to see you. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. We'll be having another event end of October. And Julia and Jennifer are out and about giving talks all the time, aren't you? So do look out for that, because this has been fantastic. Absolutely, I've learned loads. Absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great stuff. Thank you all. And yeah, we'll be back in a month. So hope to see all of you then.